The galaxy begged humanity for refuge, Earth arrived with war fleets and salvation. The signal hit my console at 0347 hours, and my coffee went cold before I even reached for it. I am Zara Khalid, communications officer aboard the United Earth Navy flagship Unbroken, and in 6 years of deep space patrol I had never seen anything like what was crawling across my screen. It was not a standard frequency. It was not a recognizable protocol. It was every frequency, all at once, layered on top of each other like someone had taken the entire electromagnetic spectrum and filled it with screaming. I put on my headset. That was a mistake. 47 languages hit my ears in the same breath. I only spoke 3 of them, but you do not need to understand a language to understand despair. Despair sounds the same in every throat, on every world, in every corner of the universe. It is high and broken and desperate, and it grabs something deep in your chest and squeezes. I tore the headset off and stared at the waveform data instead. The signal was enormous. Not in the way a standard broadcast is enormous. This was a mass transmission, the kind you only send when there is no tomorrow and you know it. The source coordinates were deep in conclave space, the vast network of civilizations that had spent 2 centuries pretending Earth did not exist. Old species. Powerful species. Species that had once sent formal diplomatic notices to the United Earth Council explaining, politely but firmly, that humanity was too primitive, too unpredictable, and too violent to be considered for membership. We had been told, in so many ways, that the galaxy did not want us at the table. Now the galaxy was calling our number. I ran the translation filters. 47 languages resolved into fragments, none of them complete, all of them overlapping. What I could piece together was enough to make my hands shake. The galactic conclave was gone. Not retreating. Not reorganizing. Gone, in the way a fire goes gone when there is nothing left to burn. Something called the Void Choir had swept through conclave space like a tide coming in, and the tide had not gone back out. Survivor transmissions described it in terms that made very little sense to me at first. The Void Choir did not conquer territory in the way that armies conquer territory. It did not want resources or land or political power. What it wanted was harder to explain and far more frightening. It wanted quiet. It moved through populated systems and left them looking exactly the same, buildings intact, infrastructure running, every living being still alive and breathing. But those beings no longer knew their own names. They no longer knew what they had cared about, or who they had loved, or what language they had spoken since childhood. They were present but empty. Alive but gone. The choir absorbed identity itself, pulling the self out of each person like pulling thread from cloth, leaving the cloth behind but taking everything that made it a garment. Entire civilizations, erased. Not destroyed. Erased. I sat with that for about 10 seconds. Then I went back to parsing the signal, because sitting with horror was a luxury and I did not have time for luxuries. The transmission went on for hours. I catalogued, filtered, and logged every fragment I could recover. 46 of the 47 languages were alien. Velhari, Keth, Duranu, Sivlith, and dozens of others I only recognized from linguistic databases I had never expected to actually use. Then, right at the very end, buried under static and distortion like a letter hidden at the bottom of a drawer, came the 47th. It was English. Not good English. Not even close to fluent English. It was the kind of English that gets learned from old entertainment broadcasts and news feeds, the kind that gets cobbled together by someone who has never spoken it aloud with another living person. The grammar was fractured and the pronunciation, even in text form, was clearly phonetic and guessed at. But it was English. Unmistakable, impossible, and completely real. The message said, please. We heard humans do not abandon. Please. I read it 4 times. Then I read it a 4th time. Then I picked up my console and walked directly to Admiral Chen's quarters without requesting permission or announcing myself, which in 6 years I had never once done. She was awake. She was always awake. Admiral Lin Chen was the kind of person who seemed to run on something other than sleep, something older and steadier, like geological time. She was sitting at her desk with a cup of tea that was also cold, reading tactical reports, and she looked up at me with the calm expression of someone who has already decided that whatever I was about to tell her was something she could handle. I handed her the console. I pointed at the English message. I waited. She read it once. She set the console down. She looked at the wall for a moment. "Get me a fleet-wide channel," she said. "And wake the captains." "Admiral," I said, because someone had to say it, "the Conclave never recognized us. We have no legal obligation. No treaty. No alliance." Half those species filed diplomatic complaints about Earth's military expansion as recently as 30 years ago. "I know," she said. "The Void Choir has already consumed most of Conclave space. We don't have full intelligence on what we're walking into. Strategically, this is Zara." She said my name the way you say the name of someone you respect and also need to stop talking. They asked. "That is enough." She stood up, picked up her cold tea, and walked out to the bridge to begin the end of the world as we had known it, and the beginning of something none of us had words for yet. I went back to my station. I logged my shift entry for the night. I wrote one line in my private record, the record I had been keeping since I first shipped out 6 years ago, the record I always told myself no one would ever read. The galaxy screamed in 47 languages, and somehow, at the very end, it screamed in mine. I think we were always going to answer. I had been an engineer for 11 years. I had spent those 11 years on the Sao Paulo, a logistics and processing vessel that was, in any honest assessment, the least glamorous ship in the United Earth Navy. We carried equipment. We carried supplies. We carried the things that made other ships able to do the things that got written about in history files. We were not the sort of ship that anyone made films about. In the 72 hours after Admiral Chen's broadcast reached Earth, the Sao Paulo became the most important vessel I had ever served on, and I do not say that with even a trace of exaggeration. My name is Tomas Reyes, and what I am about to tell you is what salvation actually looks like from the inside. It does not look like gleaming warships cutting through the dark. It does not look like a single hero making a single perfect decision. It looks like 14,000 people working without sleep, arguing loudly, making mistakes, fixing those mistakes, and refusing to stop moving. Earth's response to Admiral Chen's broadcast was something that no other species in the galaxy had ever witnessed and would not believe when they heard about it afterward. Within 6 hours of the broadcast, the United Earth Council had convened, debated, argued ferociously, and voted. Within 12 hours, mobilization orders had gone to every military shipyard on Earth, Luna, Mars, and the outer stations. Within 24 hours, the first wave of vessels was already moving. Within 72 hours, 14,000 ships had launched. I know that number sounds invented. I know it sounds like something a storyteller adds to make the scale feel large. But I was there on the Sao Paulo's engineering deck, watching the fleet assembly on the long-range display, and I counted. Or rather, I tried to count and gave up and just stared. The fleet was not only warships. That was the part that I think no one outside of humanity would have predicted, and it was the part that ultimately mattered most. Yes, there were destroyers and carriers and strike platforms. Yes, the weapons arrays were active and the targeting systems were running warm. But alongside them, in numbers that matched the warships one for one, were hospital vessels, seed vaults, water processing ships, mobile construction platforms, school modules, agricultural support carriers, genetic archive ships carrying the biological records of every species that Earth scientists had ever been able to catalog from a distance. We had not just brought an army. We had brought everything you need to rebuild a civilization from nothing. The alien observers saw us coming on their long-range sensors and did not know what to make of us. I know this because I was there when we made first contact with the Keth refugee station at Salvatha's outer marker, and I was the one who sat across a communication terminal from Elder Orith of the Keth and watched his long, pale face cycle through emotions his species had apparently not had occasion to feel in several hundred years. The Keth were one of the oldest species in the Conclave. They had been traveling the stars when humanity was still working out agriculture. Their civilization was measured in geological ages, not centuries. And they had been among the most consistent voices in the Conclave's decision to keep Earth out of galactic politics. Elder Orith looked at our fleet on his sensor display. He looked at me. He looked back at the display. There was a very long silence. "You brought medical ships," he said. "Yes," I said. "And construction equipment." "Yes." Another silence. Why? I looked at him. I thought about how to explain it. I thought about the Sao Paulo and the 11 years I had spent carrying supplies for other people's missions, and how that had never once felt like something lesser, because you cannot build anything without the things that go into building it. Because winning a fight doesn't mean much if there's nothing left to come home to afterward, I said. We're not just here to push back the choir. We're here because people need help. All of it. Every kind. Elder Orith was quiet for a long time. Then he said something in his own language, something the translation filter rendered as approximately, "We were wrong about you." I did not say anything back. I did not think anything needed saying. The first week in Conclave space was an education in a very specific kind of horror. The worlds the Void Choir had already passed through were intact. That was the worst part. You expected destruction. You expected rubble and fire and the obvious signs of something terrible having happened. Instead, you found clean streets and functioning systems and beings who looked at you with calm, mild eyes and could not tell you their own names. We called them the Stilled. It was not a military term. It came from one of the Velhari doctors we had picked up at a refugee station, a small, bioluminescent being named Cyril, who used her people's word for it and then translated it for me as best she could. Stilled was not quite right, she said, but it was close. The choir did not take life. It took the noise. And the Velhari believed, as I came to believe, that the noise was the point. Cyril had been studying the choir since before it reached Conclave space, from fragmentary reports sent by systems that were already too far gone to send anything else. She had a theory, which she explained to me across the workbench where I was trying to fix a portable resonance scanner that had never been designed for the kind of signal analysis we were now trying to perform. The Void Choir, she said, was not a military force in any traditional sense. It was not even a species in any sense she could clearly define. It was something that had emerged from a region of space where the physics of consciousness interacted with certain resonance frequencies in ways that no one had mapped and no one had predicted. It fed, if that was the right word, on individuality. On the particular, specific, irreplaceable quality of being a distinct self with a distinct inner voice. Where there was noise, it brought silence. Where there was difference, it brought sameness. The question, Cyril said, watching me work, is whether any species can resist it. Can they? I asked. She looked at me for a moment. My people could not. The Keth could not. 40 species could not. She paused. We have not yet seen how humans respond. I set down the scanner. I looked at her. You're worried we'll be the same. I am, she said. You are a young species. Your self-structures are not as deep as ours. We thought, she stopped. We thought that made you weaker. 2 weeks later, when 3 battalions of human marines were caught in a full choir signal burst at the perimeter of Solvith Prime and not one of them stopped fighting, Cyril came to find me on the engineering deck. She did not say anything. She just sat down next to me and watched me work for a while. I did not ask her what she was thinking. I was fairly sure I already knew. The resonance barrier that my team built in those first weeks was not a miracle of science. I want to be clear about that. It was a miracle of stubbornness, which is a different thing and, I would argue, more reliable. We did not have the theoretical framework for what we were building. We did not have the materials it was supposed to require. We had components that were designed for other purposes, colleagues who had not slept in several days, a borrowed theory from Cyril that she herself described as, mostly speculation, and a collective refusal to accept that the barrier was not possible. We ran 41 failed tests in 4 days. On the 42nd, it held. Lieutenant Kara Webb, my second-in-command, looked at the readings and then looked at me with the expression of someone who has just realized they have done something that the universe was not prepared for. We didn't have the science for this, she said. No, I agreed. So how? We made the science, I said. It's what we do. The barrier went up around the first refugee station at Solvitha's outer marker. Then around the second. Then around the third. Then our team split into 4 groups and started building more, faster, with less sleep and more arguments about load tolerances than I had ever had in my life. Elder Orith came to watch the 3rd installation. He stood at a distance and observed for a long time without speaking. When the barrier activated and the blue-green shimmer of the resonance field spread across the station's perimeter, he was very still. "How long will it hold?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. Which was not a specific answer, but it was an honest one. He nodded slowly. He looked at the field. He looked at me. "We spent 200 years telling your people to stay away," he said. "We said you were too young. Too loud. Too much." I waited. "We were afraid of you," he said. I think that was the truth of it, underneath everything else. "We were afraid of how fast you moved and how much noise you made and how certain you always seemed to be that things could be fixed." He paused. "We thought certainty like that was arrogance." "Sometimes it is," I said honestly. "Yes," he agreed. "But sometimes it is just courage wearing a different face." He looked at the shimmer of the barrier. "I am grateful we were wrong about which one it was." The fleet moved deeper into conclave space. 14,000 ships, half of them carrying weapons and half of them carrying everything else. We were loud and fast and relentlessly present, and every species we passed through looked at us with the same combination of relief and disbelief, as if they had called for help in a thunderstorm and a whole ocean had shown up. We had not asked permission to come. We had not waited for an invitation beyond that one small broken message in imperfect English. They asked. That was enough. It had always been enough. And somewhere ahead, deep in the ruined heart of what had been the greatest civilization in the galaxy, the void choir was still moving, still spreading its silence from world to world. We were moving faster. My name is Asha Okonkwo, and I have been a Marine for 14 years. I have trained for every kind of engagement that military planners could conceive of. Urban combat. Zero-gravity assault. Atmospheric insertion. Chemical hazard operations. Hostage recovery. I have a file of completed exercises that fills 3 archive disks, and every scenario in it was designed by people who had studied war in great detail and tried to prepare me for everything. None of them had prepared me for Solveth Prime. The briefing room of the carrier Griffin was standing room only when Admiral Chen laid out the assault plan. 5 Allied alien commanders were present, representing the surviving military forces of the Keth, the Velhari, the Duranu, and 2 other species whose names I am rendering phonetically because their actual designations are outside the range of human speech. They had come with their own plans, developed over long consultations and careful strategic analysis. The Keth commander, a tall being named Velareth who moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had been alive for 3 centuries, presented a siege strategy that he projected would take 14 months. Admiral Chen listened to all of it. She was polite. She asked good questions. She took notes. Then she said, "We're going in at 0496 hours." There was a silence in the briefing room that had a particular texture. It was the silence of beings who have just heard something they are not sure they understood correctly. Velareth looked at her for a long moment. "Commander Chen," he said carefully, "the choir's central node at Solveth Prime is protected by 17 resonance emitter arrays and an estimated 400,000 stilled beings acting as a perimeter presence. A direct assault within that time frame would require." "I know what it requires," Chen said. "My people will provide it." Another silence. "We have not yet assessed human combat capability against choir-influenced targets," Velareth said. "You're about to," Chen said. She looked around the room. "I want every Allied unit on the outer perimeter as a secondary support line. My Marines take the primary assault. Any questions?" There were several questions. She answered them all with the same calm. The Allied commanders left the briefing looking uncertain and, I noticed, quietly relieved in the way that people look relieved when someone else has volunteered to carry the heaviest part of the load. I stayed behind. Chen looked at me. "You think 96 hours is enough?" I asked. "I think it has to be," she said. "The choir is expanding. Every hour we wait is another world. So we don't wait." She looked at the tactical display, at the glowing shape of Solveth Prime with its overlaid threat data. "Take your best people, Asha. All of them." I took the 3rd Rapid Assault Division in at 0347 hours on the 4th day, because apparently 0347 was simply the hour when everything significant happened, and I had stopped questioning it. Solveth Prime from the air looked like a world that had not been told it was a ruin. The cities were intact. The lights were on. The infrastructure was running. The roads carried traffic. If you looked at it from high enough, you could almost tell yourself it was fine. Then you dropped lower, and you saw the people, and you understood. They moved in organized patterns. They performed tasks with clear efficiency. They did not look up at the assault dropships descending on their city. They did not run. They did not take cover. They simply continued what they were doing, calmly, quietly, with no expression on their faces and no light behind their eyes. They were not enemies in any traditional sense. They were not threatening us. They were just there, utterly empty, like furniture that breathed. I gave my unit the same instruction I had been turning over in my mind since the briefing. Do not fire unless fired upon. If the stilled advance on your position, fall back. Non-lethal deterrence only where possible. We are not here to hurt victims. The still did not attack us. They moved around us like water around stones. That was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. We pushed toward the city center, toward the choir's core node, which showed on our scanners as a zone of absolute signal saturation. Everything within 2 kilometers of it was broadcasting at maximum frequency. The resonance barrier units my squad carried were calibrated specifically for this kind of exposure. Tomas's team had spent 70 hours refining the portable versions after the fixed installations, and they worked. Mostly. We were 4 kilometers from the node when the first barrier unit failed. Then the second. Then, within 60 seconds, every portable barrier in my forward squad went dark simultaneously. The choir signal hit us full force. I want to describe what it felt like, and I want to be accurate, because I think it matters to understand what we were facing and why the next 60 seconds were the most important 60 seconds of the entire campaign. The signal was not painful. It did not hurt. It was something far more subtle and far more frightening. It was a feeling of distance. Of yourself becoming very far away. Of the thing that is specifically and particularly you beginning to recede like a tide going out, slowly, gently, without drama. I heard, very clearly, inside my own head, a silence beginning to form. I want to be honest about what I did next. I did not resist it through heroism or training or any particular strength of will that I can point to and explain. What I did was think of the most specifically, annoyingly, irreducibly me thing I could find in my own memory. I thought of the argument I had with my younger brother Owen at age 17 about whether his music was good or just loud, which lasted 4 hours and ended with both of us laughing so hard we could not speak. I thought of the particular way my grandmother's kitchen smelled on Sunday mornings. I thought of my own name, said in my mother's voice, and the way she always put a little extra weight on the second syllable like it was something valuable. The silence did not take hold. Around me, I could hear my Marines. Not in the way you hear soldiers receiving orders. In the way you hear people being stubbornly, defiantly, irreducibly themselves. Corporal Owen Price was saying something profane and creative about the barrier units. Sergeant Lily Dawson was reciting, at volume, a passage from a book she had apparently memorized entirely. Private Cal Morton was singing. It was off-key and it was loud and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The choir signal could not find purchase. There was nothing quiet enough in us for it to take hold. You cannot silence something that was never quiet. We pushed the last 4 kilometers with no barriers and no protection except ourselves, which turned out to be sufficient. The node was in what had been Solvith Prime's governmental center, a vast building of pale stone and crystalline spires that the choir had not damaged in any physical way. It had simply made the building its own by removing everyone inside. It looked like a palace that had forgotten it was a palace. We cleared the outer perimeter in 40 minutes. We reached the node chamber in another 20. The chamber itself was a space the size of a sports arena, and at its center was something I do not have adequate words for. It was a presence more than an object. A concentration of the signal so intense that the air itself seemed to hum with it, and the walls seemed to lean inward toward it, and the light seemed reluctant to bounce off surfaces normally. It was aware of us. I felt that immediately. Not in the way that a thinking being is aware of you, calculating and intentional. In the way that a process is aware of an obstacle. We were an anomaly. We were something that was not resolving the way it should. The broadcast it sent was not in language, exactly. My communications implant rendered it as language because that was the closest framework available. What it sent was a question. Simple. Genuine. Confused in the way that a natural force can be confused when something does not behave according to the pattern. The question was, why do you still want to be yourselves? I stood in that chamber with that question echoing in my implant, and I thought about it for exactly as long as it took me to raise my disruption emitter and calibrate it to the node's frequency signature. Because we like us, I said. And I activated the emitter. The node did not go quietly. The signal spiked to levels that my equipment was not rated for and that I do not entirely remember clearly. What I remember is the sound, which was less a sound and more a feeling, a pressure releasing, a held breath finally let go. And then quiet. Real quiet. The kind that meant something had ended rather than something had been taken. The stilled across Solveth Prime stopped moving at 1,147 hours. They stood where they were and then, slowly, like people waking from a deep sleep, they began to look around. Some of them sat down. Some of them made sounds that the translation filters could not parse because they were not language, they were just the noise of a self reforming around its own center. I sat down on the floor of the node chamber. Lily Dawson sat down next to me. Cal Morton, who had apparently not stopped singing at any point during the assault, finally went quiet and looked around with the expression of someone who is not sure what year it is. "We good?" he asked. "We're good," I said. My comm unit opened. Admiral Chen's voice. Okonkwo. Report. Node down, I said. Signal terminated. Solveth Prime is clear. I paused. Tell Tomas his barriers need work. There was a sound from Chen that I had never once heard from her in 6 years. It took me a moment to identify it. She was laughing. The 96-hour offensive ended at 1,203 hours. 3 hours ahead of schedule. The Allied commanders did not say anything for a long time when the reports came in. Velareth, according to the communications log I reviewed afterward, sat in his command center and looked at the tactical display for 22 minutes without speaking. He sent one message to Admiral Chen. 4 words. "We understand now. Thank you. My name is Priya Sundaram, and I had been trying to get into this room for 20 years. Not this specific room, technically. The specific room was new, a temporary facility assembled from prefabricated units in the ruins of the old Conclave Administrative Station at Meridian Point, because the original Galactic Council chambers were currently somewhere in the middle of a system that the Void Choir had reached before we could. But the idea of the room, the concept of it, the thing it represented, a table where the civilizations of the galaxy sat together and made decisions about the future, I had been trying to get humanity into that room since before I was an ambassador. I had submitted 14 formal applications for observer status. The Conclave had rejected all 14. The reasons varied in their specific language but were consistent in their meaning. Humanity was not ready. Humanity was not suitable. Humanity needed more time to mature. Now I was sitting at the head of the table. I want to say something honest about that before I go further. The feeling of sitting in that chair was not triumphant. I had expected, in the years when I was still trying to get in through the door, that if I ever found myself on the other side of it, I would feel something clean and satisfying. A sense of rightness. A closing of a circle. What I actually felt was tired. And sad. And grateful in a way that was almost indistinguishable from grief. 47 species were represented at that table. Some of them were there in person. Some were projections from ships or stations, because their home systems were gone and they were living in transit. Some were represented by the most senior surviving member of their government, which in 3 cases meant someone who had been a junior official 2 months ago and was now, by default, the closest thing their people had to leadership. They were all looking at me. And I knew what they were waiting for. But I did not start with what they expected. I did not start with policy, or with the structure of the new council, or with the question of who would lead what and how decisions would be made. I started with a number. 340,000. I said it clearly, and then I said it again, and then I said, that is the number of human beings who gave their lives between the moment we received the distress signal and the moment Solveth Prime's node went dark. 340,000 people who had names and families and arguments they were in the middle of and books they had not finished reading and things they meant to say to someone and never got around to saying. The chamber was completely silent. I am going to read every name, I said. All of them. This will take time. I ask that you remain. I did not look up to see their reactions. I opened the file. I began to read. The first name was Aaron Bassett, age 23, engineering support, killed in the first choir signal breach at the outer marker. The last name, 340,000 names later, was Zoe Whitmore, age 31, medical officer, who died not from the choir but from a structural collapse in a refugee station she was trying to evacuate. It took 11 minutes to read all 340,000 names at the pace I read them, which was not fast and was not slow. It was the pace of a person saying something that deserves to be said properly. When I finished, the chamber was still silent. Then, from somewhere on the far side of the table, a sound began. I looked up. Elder Orith of the Keth was doing something that I realized, with a delay, was the Keth form of grieving. A low, resonant sound produced from somewhere deep in their chest, rhythmic and sustained. After a moment, the Velhari representative beside him made a different sound, lighter and more complex, which served the same function for a people. Then others began. Different sounds, different expressions, different physical forms that grief takes when it lives in different kinds of bodies. For 11 minutes, the chamber was filled with the sound of 47 species grieving 340,000 humans. 1 second per name. It was not something I had planned. It was something that happened because it was the only right thing that could happen. When it ended, I waited a moment longer. Then I said, "Now we can talk about the future." The conversation that followed was not simple. It was never going to be simple. There were factions among the surviving conclave species who had arrived at this meeting with agendas, and those agendas were not all aligned, and some of them were directly opposed to each other, and several of them were directly opposed to humanity. The most vocal challenge came from a coalition of 4 species led by the Durana representative, a compact, dense being named Threshavala who had the kind of precise, rapid speech pattern that tells you someone has been rehearsing their arguments for days. He presented his coalition's position in clear terms. Humanity had demonstrated extraordinary military capability during the crisis. That capability, he argued, now represented the single largest concentration of force in the galaxy. This was a concern. The appropriate response to this concern, in the coalition's view, was a demilitarization agreement, under which Earth's war fleet would be substantially reduced as a condition of humanity's participation in the new council. He was very polite about it. He used careful language. But the argument was plain. You frightened us. We want you smaller. We want you less. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "I understand the concern. And I want to address it directly, because I think we will accomplish more with honesty than with diplomacy." Threshavala looked at me steadily. "Please. The concern is not really about military size," I said. "It is about power. And you are not wrong that there is an imbalance. There is. Humanity currently holds a level of influence in this region of space that we did not hold 2 months ago, and that shift happened very fast, and fast shifts are frightening." I paused. "But I want you to consider what that influence was used for." I pulled up the logistics report that Tomas had sent me from the Sao Paulo 3 days earlier. I displayed it on the chamber's shared screen. Ship manifests. Supply tallies. Medical records. Reconstruction materials delivered. Emergency food supplies distributed. Biological archive data shared freely with every species whose own records had been lost. "We did not come here to take anything," I said. "We came here because someone asked. And we brought everything we had, not just the weapons, because we understood that winning the fight was only the beginning of the problem. The rest of the problem is right here in this room, and it is going to take a long time and a lot of work and a lot of disagreement and probably a great deal of frustration." I set down the report. What humanity wants is not power. What we want is what we were denied for 200 years. A seat. Equal standing. The right to be part of the conversation about the future of the galaxy, not because we have earned it by force, but because we were always here. We were always part of this. We were just never allowed to say so. Threshavala was quiet for a moment. "And the fleet? The fleet will remain as it is for now," I said. "Not as a threat. As a commitment. Because the void choir is broken but not gone. There are still nodes in the outer systems. There are still stilled populations that need the resonance treatment. There is still work to do. When the work is done, we can talk about what the appropriate force levels are for a galaxy that is no longer in crisis. Another silence. And if we disagree about when the crisis is over? Threshavala asked. Then we will disagree about it at this table, I said. Out loud. On the record. Like members of the same civilization who trust each other enough to have the argument instead of having the war. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the display. The numbers. The supplies. The names. He sat back. He did not agree. But he did not escalate. And in a room full of beings who had spent 2 months losing everything they knew, not escalating was as close to yes as yes was going to come for a while. Elder Orith spoke next. He rose from his chair, which for a Keth is a formal gesture of deliberate significance, and he spoke clearly. 200 years ago, he said, this council issued a formal exclusion order regarding the planet Earth and its people. The stated reasons were readiness, compatibility, and temperament. I was a junior member of the council at that time. I voted in favor of the order. The chamber was absolutely still. I was wrong, he said. He reached into his robe and produced a physical document, a rare thing, a material object in a world of digital records, and he set it on the table in front of me. This is the formal withdrawal of the exclusion order, signed by every surviving senior member of the Keth Council. It is retroactive, and it carries an acknowledgement of the wrong that was done. He looked at me. It does not undo 200 years. I know that. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But it is what we have, he said. I looked at the document for a moment. It was handwritten, because the Keth still wrote important things by hand, in their own script which I could not read. Around it, on the table, the other representatives were watching me. I thought about the 14 applications. The 14 rejections. The careful, polite language that always meant the same thing, which was that we were not wanted here, that we were too much, too loud, too young, too human. I thought about 340,000 names. I picked up the document. I held it carefully. I said, thank you. That was all. I did not make a speech about it. I did not turn it into the triumphant moment that a part of me had imagined for years. I just held it and said thank you, because that was what was true, and because the room full of beings who had lost so much did not need me to be victorious. They needed me to be present. They needed me to be human, specifically and loudly human, the same way Asha's Marines had been in that node chamber, refusing to be made smaller than they were. The rest of the session covered structure and governance and resource allocation and the immediate priorities for the reconstruction effort. We agreed on a provisional framework. We disagreed on 11 points within it. We scheduled 6 follow-up sessions to address those points. We did not solve everything. We were not going to solve everything in one room in one day, and anyone who had told you otherwise was selling something. But we were in the room. Together. Out loud. Outside the chamber windows, the stars were the same stars they had always been. They did not look different because humanity was finally at the table. The universe does not rearrange itself to mark the moments that matter to the beings living in it. But I was there. And I will tell you that they looked, for just a moment, a little less cold. When the session ended and the chamber began to empty, Priya Sundaram, ambassador at large for the United Earth, sat alone at the table for a few minutes. She did not cry. She was past crying by then, or maybe past the kind of crying that is about sorrow, or maybe she just needed a moment to be somewhere quiet that she had earned. Then she picked up her files and walked out into the corridor and called Tomas on the Sao Paulo to tell him the session had gone as well as could be expected. He cried. She did not tell anyone that part. Some things are private, even in the middle of history. The Unbroken crossed back through the solar boundary at 0902 hours on a Tuesday, and I was at my console when it happened, because where else would I be? I am Zara Khalid. This is where the story started, sitting at my station in the pre-dawn hours with cold coffee and a signal I did not understand. It seems right that it should come back to me here, at the end of something and the beginning of something else, sitting in the same chair with a different sky outside the viewport. The solar system looks a certain way when you have been gone for a long time. I cannot describe it scientifically. I can only tell you that when the Unbroken's long-range sensors resolved the sun into something visible rather than just a data point, something in my chest changed. Not released, exactly. Settled. The way a thing settles when it has been uncertain for so long that you stop noticing the uncertainty, and then it becomes certain, and you realize how long you had been holding. We had been out for 8 months. In that time I had intercepted, processed, and responded to more transmissions than I had in the previous 6 years combined. My station looked like someone had attempted to file a library using a system that made sense to exactly one person. I had started calling my console by a name, which I will not share because it is embarrassing, but which made the long nights feel less long. We were going home. And before we got there, I had one more thing to do. The young Velhari had been found in the 3rd week of the campaign, at a refugee station near the outer marker. She was aboard a civilian transport that had barely made it out of her home system before the choir reached it. She was alone, because her family had not made it to the transport, and she was small, and she was the bravest person I had ever encountered, because she was 8 years old by Velhari reckoning, which is roughly equivalent to 11 in human years, and she had sat down in front of a damaged communications terminal and composed and transmitted a message in a language she had taught herself from entertainment broadcasts and news feeds. Her name, in Velhari, was a combination of bioluminescent pulses that translated imperfectly into sound. The closest English rendering was a name that meant "she who asks." We called her Asha, which made Commander Okonkwo smile every time she heard it and made the young Velhari herself very pleased, because she had decided that if she was going to have a human name, it should belong to a human she admired. I had been exchanging messages with her throughout the campaign. She was currently aboard the Velhari relief ship Luminant, headed to the reconstruction settlement that was being established on a world 2 systems over from what had been her home. She had asked me, in her 3rd message, to explain the word stubborn. I had sent back a 3-paragraph explanation. She had written back one line, "I think this is the best word. I think it is what humans are." I sent her a message as the Unbroken crossed the solar boundary. It was not long. I told her where we were, and that the sun looked the same as it always had, and that I was glad she had sent that transmission in English, and that I hoped the settlement was everything a new home was supposed to be. Then I described Earth for her, because she had asked me to, in an earlier message, with the specific request that I tell her what it looked like when you could see the whole of it, not just an image, but really see it, with a person's eyes from a ship's viewport. This is what I told her. It is small. That is the first thing. The universe is very large, and Earth is very small, and when you see it in its actual scale against the actual size of space, you understand something about it that is hard to put into words. It should not be significant, by the mathematics of size. It is not the biggest planet in its own system. It is not the oldest world in this region of space. It has no particular geological distinction, no remarkable position, no feature that would make any neutral observer stop and take special notice. And yet, it is blue. That is the second thing. So much blue. Water and atmosphere conspiring to make something that looks, from a distance, like a suggestion, like the universe thought of something and then committed to it fully. The clouds move while you watch. The planet turns. It does not hold still for you, and I find that deeply appropriate. What I told Asha was this. I told her that Earth looks, from a distance, like it is arguing with the sun. Like it is taking up slightly more space than its size entitles it to. Like it arrived somewhere it was not expected and then immediately started rearranging the furniture. I told her that I had been looking at it my whole life and I had been away from it for 8 months and now I was looking at it again, and it looked exactly the same as it always had, which is to say it looked like something that was not particularly interested in being small. She wrote back within 3 minutes, which meant she had been waiting at her terminal. The message said, "That is a very stubborn planet." Yes, I wrote back. It really is. The fleet arrived in Earth's outer system in stages over the following 18 hours. The ones that arrived first were met by civilian vessels, by the orbital platforms with their lights running, by communications traffic so dense that my console had to filter it in layers just to keep up. Earth had been following the campaign in real time through the feeds we transmitted. They had watched everything. They had waited for us the way you wait for someone who has been somewhere they could not call back from, checking the feed constantly, and then trying not to check it, and then checking it again. When the first ships crossed into the inner system, there was no fanfare in the formal sense. There was not a ceremony or a broadcast speech or a scheduled moment. What there was an absence of the ordinary silence. The communications channels opened and stayed open. Families who had been waiting for 8 months simply started talking to the people they had been waiting for, and the noise of it flooded every frequency, and for once I did not try to filter it. I just listened. I let all of it in, all of it at once, the voices and the language and the noise of 11 billion people being exactly and specifically themselves, and I thought about a presence in a ruined palace on Solvith Prime that had looked at us and asked, in genuine confusion, why we wanted to be ourselves. I thought I finally had an answer that was more complete than what Asha had said in that chamber, though hers was a good answer. A true answer. The reason we wanted to be ourselves was not complicated. It was not philosophical. It was not a principle or a belief system or a doctrine. It was something much simpler and much older than any of those things. It was that when you have a self, you can choose what to do with it. When you know your own name, you can decide what that name means and what you are going to do in the time you have. You can hear a signal in 47 languages in the middle of the night and decide, before anyone has told you what to decide, that you are going to answer it. You can be a young engineer on a supply ship and build something the universe said could not be built. You can be a marine in a ruined city and remember your own name so clearly that nothing can take it from you. You can sit at a table you were kept away from for 2 centuries and speak plainly and honestly and hold a document with shaking hands and say thank you and mean it fully. You can choose. The Void Choir could not understand that, because the Void Choir had never had it. It had existed as a process, a vast and terrible and ultimately lonely process, reaching out across the galaxy for silence, because silence was all it knew. It had never had a name. It had never had a memory of a Sunday kitchen or a 4-hour argument with a younger brother. It had never looked at a small blue planet from a great distance and felt something settle in its chest. I felt sorry for it, standing at the edge of what it had done and what it had cost and what it had tried to take from the galaxy. I felt sorry for it in the abstract way that you can feel sorry for a force that has no cruelty in it because it has no self. It was not evil. It was empty, and it spread emptiness because that was all it had to give. We had more to give. We had always had more to give. That was what 200 years of closed doors had failed to understand about us. You cannot shut out a species that measures its own value by what it gives away. Every exclusion order, every diplomatic rejection, every polite notice about humanity's unsuitability had simply accumulated into pressure, and pressure, if you know anything about humans, does not produce stillness. It produces exactly the opposite. The Unbroken reached Earth orbit at 1,617 hours. I filed my final log entry for the campaign. It was longer than usual. I had been composing it in my head for several weeks, adding to it and revising it the way you revise something that you know is going to matter. I will share some of it here, because I think it says what I want the record to say about what happened to us and what we did and what we learned. They called us loud. That was always the first thing. Too loud, too fast, too certain, too young. They looked at us and saw a species that had not yet learned to be quiet, and they mistook that for immaturity. They thought our noise was a phase that we would eventually grow out of. They thought that if they waited long enough, we would become something more like them. They were wrong, and I want to be specific about how they were wrong. It was not that we were secretly wise and dignified under the surface. We were loud. We were fast. We were certain. We were all of the things they complained about. That was not a mask. That was not a phase. That was us. What they failed to understand was what the noise meant. It was not arrogance. It was not immaturity. It was the sound of a species that had decided, somewhere back in its own long difficult history, that it was going to keep being itself no matter what. That it was going to stay interested in things and care about people and argue loudly and fix what was broken and ask more questions than it had answers to, and do all of this at a volume that the rest of the universe found excessive. The Void Choir found us impossible. An entire galaxy almost went silent. We were the reason it did not because of our weapons, though our weapons mattered, and not because of our technology, though Tomas and Kara and their team proved that human engineers are in a category entirely their own. We were the reason because we were too loud and too stubborn and too specifically ourselves to go quiet. They called us violent. They were partly right. We have violence in us, the way any species that survived its own history has violence in it. We have made terrible choices and we carry those choices with us the way all species carry their histories. But what they missed was that we have never once been satisfied with violence as an ending. We always have to build something afterward. We cannot help it. We are constitutionally incapable of walking away from a ruin without at least thinking about what could go there instead. They called us young. That one was always the funniest to me, even when it stung. Yes. We are young. And we showed up to a galaxy that was burning with 14,000 ships, half weapons and half everything else, because that is what young looks like when young has decided to show up fully. I closed the log. I looked out the viewport at Earth, which was doing its usual thing of being blue and stubborn and turning slowly without caring whether anyone was watching. One more thing arrived in my transmission queue as we descended into lower orbit. The final communication in a chain that had been running since Asha's first message went out. It was not from any government or command authority. It was from 43 different sources, 43 species, each sending a short transmission in their own language. The translation filters resolved all of them into the same thing, the same word, rendered 43 different ways by 43 different kinds of throat and language structure. Thank you. I sat with that for a moment. The same way I had sat with the original signal, all those months ago, in the pre-dawn dark with cold coffee and the sound of 47 languages of despair all at once. Then I closed the transmission queue. I logged out of my station. I collected my things, which had accumulated over 8 months into an amount that was mildly embarrassing. I walked off the bridge and through the corridor and down to where the shuttle bays were, because we had been given landing authorization and I had somewhere to be. I did not respond to the broadcast. Not because I did not have anything to say, but because some things do not need an answer. Some things just need to be received, held for a moment, and then carried forward into whatever comes next. I stepped into the shuttle. The hatch sealed. The engines came up. We went home.